Forgiveness is simply complicated. I also think forgiveness is one of those words we sometimes use so much it becomes an idea rather than the result of an action. Forgiving is an action. What does forgiving look like? The best way I could get at that, this week at least, was to think about its opposite. What is the opposite of forgiving? Binding. Tying that offense, be it collective or individual, to the offender forever, not allowing movement. Binding. In the parable in our gospel lesson for today, Jesus tells of one who owes 10,000 talents. The amount of 10,000 talents is unimaginably huge. It's an impossible amount for a reckoning. Every little thing accumulated over a whole lifetime. The king doesn't bind it, though. He looses it and frees the servant from the burden of that debt. Which brings us to the next question. Now what? What are we freed for? What are we forgiven for? We're forgiven by God's grace and no longer bound to that burden or barrier. We can move again. So much relieved. How could you not go out and do likewise? What are we forgiven for? Maybe, using the same approach as earlier, we ask what the opposite would be. Again, the one forgiven the 10,000 talent debt seems to illustrate that, seems to be the opposite. He goes out, forgiven and freed, and then is actually violent with the next person he comes across. He's very deferring to the king, but then turns around and grabs someone of his station by the throat. That's an opposite, I think. We're not forgiven so we can go out and do that. What are we forgiven for then? We are forgiven for good, for being able to move again and be relieved of the binding of our mistakes. We're forgiven to go out and do good in kind. What does forgiving look like? Not as an idea, but as an action. There's a realness to it, and it can be complicated when it becomes real. Simply complicated. And we have to note that there is a difference between forgiveness and consequences. An example I often used, if you're driving too fast on any particular road, even if there's no one else around and someone pulls you over, God still loves you, but you're getting a speeding ticket. Yeah? There are times when actions can hurt someone or break something or break a rule, and you might be forgiven, but the consequences of that remain. Right? The ticket is still going to be written. The plate might still be broken, etc. And there are bigger consequences that last that are practical too. The king may have let go of the debt, but I also can't help but notice that he didn't loan him anything more either. That puts a slightly different perspective to it. But that's what parables do. They invite you into the scene to look around and notice what you notice. Sometimes I think it can be easy for some to take advantage of a lesson like this and twist it to mean that someone should allow themselves to be hurt or tricked or whatever over and over again and just forgive and suffer again and forgive and let the same behavior continue. Let me be extremely clear. This is not that. Consequences are different. Forgiveness, not binding, doesn't mean putting yourself into a place or situation over and over again either. The forgiver is allowed to learn and grow too. Forgiveness, simply complicated. The first debtor is given a chance at a path forward. The choice they make is to continue in greed and material concerns, without compassion or mercy, and with a harsh violence. It's a cautionary parable, and a bigger picture at the same time. And Peter starts out this whole conversation by asking how many times someone has to forgive. Like it is an idea or an intellectual exercise, a way to tally up and keep track and be able to, get to this point and say it's game over. But then we have Jesus' reply, 77 times and 10,000 talents. Things you couldn't keep track of. Suddenly we have a number we can't fathom, but a story we can. Because this is not an intellectual exercise or a tally sheet or even a game. It's a way of living that allows us all to move and breathe and keep living. To be freed for good. To be able to try again. To do better. To do good. Simply complicated.